Hello and welcome to Bad Gays, a podcast all about evil and complicated queer people in history. My name's Hugh Lemmy, I'm a writer and author.
And I'm Ben Miller, a writer and researcher currently at work on a new biography of the fashion designer Rudi Gernreich.
So last week we were talking about the 18th century Georgian thief-taker and member of the Sodomitish Academy, Charles Hitchin. Who are we talking about this week, Ben?
Today I'm going to do something that's a callback to early seasons and begin the episode by reading a poem. The poem is entitled To a Young Fisherman. Your naked feet more tender than a tulip, a rose less handsome than your ruddy cheeks. In no other's eyes did I read more replete such a boundless hankering for friendship. Behind us the eternity of the sea, above paled gray the everlasting sky, drifting on the lonely beach just we, alone, no other than the sea to pry. I went to my city, our last day ended. You sail and fish content, I drift and brood, and find no city refuge, nor stiller field. I am so tired, yet much I have loved. Forgive me much, ask not what I withstood, and pray I never to your beauty yield.
Okay.
So that poem, in its original Dutch, appears excerpted on Amsterdam's Homo Monument, which is one of the first memorials to the persecution of gay people ever built in 1979. It was written by the subject of today's episode, Jacob Israël de Haan, and we can understand why it was chosen, right, with its elegiac, melancholic references to the love that dare not speak its name. I don't think anyone suggested engraving this next poem by de Haan onto any monuments, but I want to read it here because it does open up the other side of his personality. This one is entitled Doubt. The year sneaks in God's capital city near the western wall. Tonight, what is it that I long for? The sanctity of Israel or an Arab male prostitute?
Okay, so we're already dealing with a complex person straight off the bat.
We are. Jacob Israël de Haan is a fascinating figure. He was born in 1881 in the Netherlands. He was assassinated at the age of 42 in Palestine, having moved there to establish Zion and then having turned on the Zionist project because of its treatment of the Arabs. He was assassinated by a Zionist paramilitary, the Haganah, and his love of young Arab men would be both a source of scandal and a very troubling source of evolving solidarity. So de Haan was born in Smilde in 1881. Smilde is north of Amsterdam in the province of Drenthe, which borders Germany. Dear Dutch listeners, you have a language that I find very funny and very appealing and which I have a very difficult time pronouncing. Please excuse. I'm doing my best. I speak both German and English, and yet somehow Dutch evades me. So, in the province of Drenthe, which borders Germany, the Netherlands was unusually religiously tolerant, right? And Jews had been full citizens since 1796, which is pretty early in terms of the emancipation of the Jews. But this tolerance would, of course, be brutally reversed when 75% of Dutch Jews, including most famously Anne Frank, were systematically exterminated by the National Socialists with the enthusiastic collaboration of the vast majority of non-Jewish Dutch people. De Haan's father was a cantor, and his older sister, Carrie van Bruggen, would also become a very well-known author. And Jacob and Carrie were 2 of 18.
Wow.
Yeah. So his father, Isaac, moved the family when Jacob was young to Zaandam and raised his young children there in what was, in Zaandam, a very strict and old-fashioned religious Jewish community. There were only 200 Jews in Zaandam, but they lived in this sort of all-encompassing world. They had their own institutions, and they were a very sort of tight-knit group.
And they were Orthodox.
Yes. Of the town, he later wrote, quote, I had no all-controlling joys there, nor so much sorrow. He was bright, he was precocious, he was apparently not the easiest child. He was a rebel, and so he rebelled against this sort of strict Jewish upbringing, and he ran off at 14 to attend the National School for Teachers in Amsterdam. There he settled on several different political paths, starting with anarchism, eventually socialism. He trained as a teacher and became editor of the children's section of the main Dutch socialist newspaper, which was called Het Volk. And so we basically have here the triple threat of turn-of-the-century bohemians. We have socialism, we have artists' friends, and we have Freudianism.
Okay.
In 1904, he published his first novel, which was called Pijpenlijntjes. And the title means pipelines, and it's also a reference to De Pijp, which is a working-class neighborhood in Amsterdam.
Yeah, in the south.
But it's also a reference to the verb pijpen, which at this time is the Dutch word for sucking someone off. And this was a clue. Paramilitary would be the first ever Dutch novel about two men in a same-sex relationship that was not pornography.
Oh, okay.
The book concerns two students, Sam and Joep.
Even though it's the title comes from sucking someone off.
Even though the title comes from sucking someone off. The book concerns two students, Sam and Joep, who live in De Pijp, and they have a romantic relationship. The book is written in a naturalistic style that recalls Zola. It flows through a series of sketches depicting neighborhood life. By the way, all of my observations about this book are apparent observations or secondhand because the book has never been translated into English.
Oh, okay.
Sam loves Joep, but the relationship is troubled. It's characterized by abuse. But the most shocking thing is that at the end of the book, both characters remain alive, unpunished for their sin. Sam takes a girlfriend, Joep remains gay. Many chapters are written as dialogues, and so Hugh, I'd like us to do a dramatic reading of one section that I machine translated. I've sent you an email, if you get it open. So just read every other paragraph. So I'm Joep and you're Sam.
Okay.
In the warm bed, I lay back, the lamp was turned off, and a dark shadow cast a dim light on the objects, which were blurred. My white shawl was lying on the chair. I looked at it and became frightened. Sam, move that shawl a little. There, yes, that's good. Sam, tell me, am I really different from others?
Yes, a little, but don't talk about that now.
Yes, let's talk about it. Do you love me very much?
I'm not saying that. You know that.
Just like I love you?
Here we go, the usual questions again. I'm not saying it. It's always the same.
Come on, say it again. Just like I love you?
No, you know that. I'll say it again, but that's the last time. You love me in a positive way, and sometimes you like it when I sleep with you, but I love you a lot. But otherwise, I'm fine with what you want, but I'll never ask you. You know that.
Yes.
And you sometimes love the other guys too, and I would never want that from anyone else.
No, only from me.
Yes, I'm going to get married.
Come on. So it's definitely over between us?
God damn it, are you serious? No, but then I'm leaving.
The yellow lamplight went out, and the damp, wet darkness washed over me. Sam?
Yes.
Bye.
Bye. Don't stay up waiting for me. If I go with Siet, it'll be too late. You know that.
The door closed, and in the steady sound of rain, his footsteps faded until he was gone, and only the fuzzy darkness remained, silent.
And scene.
I think some of our listeners may enjoy us whispering sweet nothingness into our ears a little too much. But what do you make of it, Hugh?
It's okay. It's romantic.
It's a sappy little bit of romance
Yeah.
novel. I want to point out one thing. Those of us who know this phrase, different from the others, will have a clue as to an important thing that's being referenced here. This idea, pretty new for 1904, that homosexuality is an inborn condition, a way of being in the world, a subjectivity, even an identity. One way to read the book is to see Sam taking a girlfriend as evidence that you can change homosexuality, the violence of the relationship as evidence that homosexuality is bad. But another way, as pointed out on a review website called Literaturgeschiedenis, is to see Sam's violence in the relationship as arising from the fact that he won't deal with his innate homosexuality, and to see Joep's calm relationship with his sexuality as a potential model for a more tolerant world.
Yeah.
The book led to a scandal. Gay people hated it. They thought it was a negative depiction of homosexuals. The middle-class literati friends hated it because they thought it was gay. De Haan was fired from the socialist newspaper. He was fired from all of the schools where he worked. Here's a particular little twist. He had dedicated the book to Arnold Aletrino, who was a friend of his, who was probably the model for Sam, with De Haan being the model for Joep.
That's an unwelcome dedication.
And Aletrino denounced De Haan as, quote, the most depraved and unreliable individual I have ever met, and basically went around town buying as many copies as he could and destroying them.
Oh, wow.
And so the first edition remains extremely rare.
Yeah.
It was then published in a second edition, which removed his dedication, changed the characters' names. De Haan wrote, Pijplijntjes was not confiscated by the police or by a public prosecutor, nor was the edition stopped due to other reasons. I am still content as a literary artist to have written Pijplijntjes, although my life as a member of society has become much more difficult. Aletrino would himself publish a book, a kind of medical book about homosexuality called Hermaphrodism and Uranianism in 1908, but he always kept his public cover. The best support De Haan could find came from a Belgian novelist named Georges Eekhoud, who wrote, quote, De Haan wrote tactfully and with moving authenticity about the lives of two, quote, nerve-unhealthy young men who belong to a group of the extremely dejected and who are deprived of love. At last, scientists, and especially those involved in literature, are showing a bit more fairness toward these people. people need a certain predisposition in order to develop this, which in many cases is an illness. This is a scientific fact and must end the involuntary prejudice due to which people are despised and judged. The only thing for which one can blame these people is that their beliefs have given them homosexual feelings and inclinations. Everyone who loves justice and mankind will hear with deep satisfaction that the deviant, in his quest for love, is therefore not a criminal, but oftentimes will be unhappy. He is neither a violator of mankind, nor does he deserve to be disdained as someone who was born with a physical handicap. It is someone who was gifted by Mother Nature in an unfortunate manner." End quote. And that's basically Lady Gaga's Born This Way from 1984.
Yeah, I was going to say you can see that developing there, that idea.
Yeah, and I just once again want to repeat that there are better arguments for the flourishing of queer life than that we just can't help ourselves.
Yeah.
De Haan did not stop writing. He published stories in literary magazines, and in 1908 he published a second novel called Pathologies, and this is actually a gay S&M novel. People
Wow.
who have read it in Dutch say that it's, quote, in the European literary decadent tradition of Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray.
Wow.
But this novel was so scandalous it was just mostly ignored. And then, in 1907, I'm going to say a sentence that you're not going to expect. De Haan married his longtime girlfriend.
You know what? Nothing surprises me on this podcast anymore.
Would you like
The
to...
actions of gays.
Sue, would you like to hear her name?
Yes, I would, yeah.
Her name was Dr. Johanna Belia Cornelia Jacoba von Marzewiven. That's Dr. Johanna Belia Cornelia Jacoba von Marzewiven.
Amazing.
And she was 10 years his senior, and she had been a friend since his teenage years. The marriage may have been mostly intended to prove he wasn't gay in the Netherlands, but few people believed it. She was, however, a very remarkable woman. She was the first ever female medical examiner in Amsterdam, and she really had her own life and career, and is an interesting person with whom he was deeply connected as a friend, I think.
Do we know anything about her feelings towards the marriage? Was it perhaps a lavender marriage?
So it might have been, although she seemed to be very concerned about his reputation. So she actually joined Alatrino before they were married in trying to destroy all the copies of Pipe Pipelages because she thought it would ruin him.
Yeah.
And they stayed married until his death, although we'll see under what conditions. De Haan at this time continued to write his poetry, and he deepened his interest in the law. He met with the anarchist Pyotr Kropotkin in the UK, and on Kropotkin's urging traveled to Russia in 1912 to investigate prison conditions there. He published a book called In Russian Prisons, and he founded an organization that worked to improve conditions with the writers Friedrich van Eden and Henrietta Roland Holst. And this work is actually cited as the beginning of what ended up becoming Amnesty International.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He also developed a legal practice focusing on what was then the burgeoning field of significs. Now, the idea of significs was that you could solve social problems and improve the law by fighting about the meaning of specific terms. And so in 1916, he published a thesis called Legal Significa and its application to the terms liable, responsible, and culpable. But in 1917, he was passed over for a professorship, maybe because of the ongoing scandal. Now, here's another sentence that may surprise you. As De Haan was working on his PhD thesis, he was also in regular conversation with a demon.
As you are. Okay.
Yes. And this demon was named the Bitter Edge. And De Haan wrote that the Bitter Edge, quote, tortures me, confuses my soul and my senses.
And what does the bitter edge tell him to do?
So in
Sodomy by any chance?
Even worse, Zionism. In May of 1913, De Haan is walking in an Amsterdam park, and the Bitter Edge said to him, quote, return, O Israel, to the Lord your God. Return to me, for I have redeemed you, end quote. This is the beginning of his return to religion, and so his next piece of poetry was not entitled Gay S&M I Have Known, but was called The Jewish Song, and that year he joined the Mizrahi, which was the religious branch of the Zionist organization.
Right.
Now, he was embraced by the local Jewish community, but there were two fatal problems. The first was his homosexuality. Why was he strolling alone through parks at dusk?
Yeah.
Perhaps he was looking for something other than religious demons.
Yeah.
The second problem was his wife, who had once been an attempt to solve the first problem. The problem with her is that she wasn't religious, and she was born a Gentile. And De Haan furiously tried to convince her to convert, but she had extremely proud, atheist, anti-clerical, socialist principles, and she refused.
Fair.
And they started having really horrid fights, including fights in public, and they eventually separated, although they would never divorce. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration promised Palestine, then an Ottoman territory being conquered by the British, to the Zionist movement to create a national home for Jewish people. The declaration also stated that, quote, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, quote. The Zionist movement had kicked off in 1896 with the publication of Austrian Jewish journalist Theodor Herzl's text The Jewish State, which proposed such a state as the solution to what was known as the Jewish question. The question had arisen from Jewish emancipation in the 19th century, and that phrase was used by two groups, anti-Semites and Zionists. Anti-Semites understood the Jewish question as a racial problem that needed to be solved through the reinstitution of discrimination up to and including ethnic cleansing. Zionists understood the Jewish question as a problem of endless oppression that would only be solved through the establishment of a Jewish homeland. So the anti-Semitic and the Zionist Jewish question very much feed into one another. The Zionist Jewish question is very much a response to the anti-Semitic Jewish question, but it's a response that replicates its logic.
And am I right in saying that the sort of Zionist position emerges out of growing nationalism within Europe? And so the idea is if you constitute a nation, then you can have certain rights and defend yourself.
Yes, and European nationalism is also presenting a threat to the liberal emancipation of the Jews, right? Because the Jews don't belong to the nation. And that's kind of the Jewish question, right? Now, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, there's also alternative forms of Jewish organization, most famously the Jewish Labor Bund, the slogan of which is here where we are, this is our country. The idea is we're going to build the Jewish idea of Zion. It's difficult to separate all of these things out because Zionism in 1918 as a theory is a very different concept than Zionism in 2025 as a practice with a very material history. Zion is also a religious concept, which is important to distinguish from Zionism as a political reality or movement, right? Yeah. But the Bundist idea is that we will build Zion, like we will build Israel, we will build the desired earthly paradise here where we live by
a socialist society.
Socialism, by achieving a socialist society, yeah.
And the idea that the Bund is that a German Jew is a German and a Polish Jew is Polish, even if ethnically they're not Poles.
Or more importantly, they're both workers.
Yeah.
And it matters less that they're ethnic. Like the nation state, if the nation state is going to be the unit of political organization, then we'll use it to achieve the thing that we want, which is socialism.
Yeah, but it's pushing against the nationalist idea that Jews are not part of a nation, cannot be part of a nation.
And so Zionism is not a majority opinion in Jewish communities until after the Holocaust. And it is the experience of the Holocaust that makes Zionism a majority opinion among Jewish people. It's the experience of being enthusiastically persecuted, and it's the experience of basically no one, with very few exceptions. Denmark is one notable exception. But in very few countries conquered by the Nazis was there any serious attempt at all to protect Jews or to do anything other than collaborate extremely enthusiastically.
Yeah.
And it was in response to that Bundism lost its mandate in a lot of ways.
But also
and Zionism became a majoritarian opinion among Jewish people. And I've seen this play out in sources and things that I've researched myself. You can see people say in 48, 49, I never was a Zionist, but now I'm happy that there's an Israel.
But also, presumably, in the Holocaust, a huge number of Bundist organizers and talented organizers and theoreticians were all exterminated.
Yes, that's the other thing. I mean, the people who survived tended to be the people with more resources because they were the people who could get themselves out. And so the class basis changed. So Herzl died in 1904, and the Zionist movement was taken over by Chaim Weizmann, who was a chemist who was born in Russia. He moved to Switzerland and then the UK. And Weizmann had tirelessly lobbied UK politicians in favor of Balfour. In 1919, de Haan wrote Weizmann and asked to move to Palestine and join the struggle. He wrote, quote, I am not leaving Holland to improve my condition. Neither materially nor intellectually will life in Palestine be equal to my life here. I am one of the best poets of my generation and the only important Jewish national poet Holland has ever had. It is difficult to give up all this, end quote. Modest. So he left his wife, who he never would actually divorce, behind, and he planned to support himself writing articles for the Dutch newspaper Algemeen Handelsblad. When he left, the train station was filled with a crowd watching him depart, singing the Hatikva, but apparently one of them said that many people showed up just to make sure that he actually left.
Well, it's the Hatitva.
That's now the national anthem of Israel.
Oh, okay. Like a Zionist song.
Yeah. He arrived in April 1918 in Jerusalem. No dignitaries lined the station tracks to meet him. There was a persistent, damp, chilly drizzle in the Holy Land. The baggage handler tried to steal from him. He had suffered a lot of indignities. He actually ignored Chaim Weizmann's warning that not all immigrants were admitted to Palestine, and physical condition played a role. You had to go to Cairo and then basically plead your case for the British to let you through, and he almost didn't make it.
So if, for example, you have an illness or tuberculosis or something, then they're not going to let you in.
They might not let you in, yeah. De Haan was sickly, and he repeatedly asserted his desire to be a consul from the Netherlands to Palestine, but this never worked. Here's a description that he wrote about the Wailing Wall. Quote, "People go and they come. Yemenite Jews with black long locks along a fine face. Ashkenazi Jews in cloaks of silk, hard red, hard yellow, hard blue. A Polish fur cap on. Sephardim with a fez, which the lawman wrapped with a black silk cloth. Large Moroccans barefoot in wide and long-pointed shoes. A white, yellow, or heavy black cloak over the high shoulders. Small, pious women arrive, who kisses the wall and raises their hands as a mother blesses her sons."
He can write. Is there any account that he gives at that point of how he feels about the Arabs who are living there?
Oh, there is. We'll get there. So, upon arrival, he moved into the Hotel Amdursky, which was next to the town of David. Herman Melville traveled there and described it as, quote, "A chamber low and scored by time, masonry old, late washed with lime, much like a tomb new cut in stone," end quote. So he then presents himself to the Zionist agency and says, "Hello, I am a poet and I would like to work to build the homeland," and he's rebuffed, right? He is a classic diaspora Jew, right? Sickly, bespectacled, cosmopolitan, and intellectual. He's not a kind of muscular farmer-settler new Jew that's needed to settle the nation. But he did work his way into the social circles of a woman named Annie Edith Landau, who ran the local Evelina de Rothschild School for Girls, and she also hosted a salon which included Jews, British colonial administrators, and Arabs. Now, at first, De Haan treated the Arabs with a racist disdain. He was quoted as saying to an Arab leader at Miss Landau's Hanukkah reception, quote, "Two people can't sit on the same chair. This land was given to us, and you should take your wives and your children, load up your camels, and go away. The Arab lands are large, but here there's no more room for you," end quote.
Which is exactly the same rhetoric as we hear today.
Exactly. Now, he claimed later that he didn't say it, and that this was a scurrilous rumor, but it did cause enough scandal to cause him to be officially dropped by the Yishuv, which was the official Zionist organization, and he was socially ostracized. But he was unwilling to return to the Netherlands, and so instead he began befriending Arabs. He moved in with a man named Abdul Salam Aweda, and the Aweda brothers, Abdul Salam and his younger brother Adil, were politically active in Palestinian nationalist movements. Rumors spread about a possible relationship between De Haan and Adil Aweda, and the brothers introduced him to the rich and very much existing domestic Palestinian Arab culture and way of life, which he had previously seen as a tabula rasa on which a Jewish home could be built. He took an Arab valet, and the two slept in the same bedroom, with the doors locked. And from these people, he started learning that the Arabs, too, as it turns out, had been promised a state by Lawrence of Arabia and others. Christians and Bedouins began to join Muslims in what became the nascent Palestinian nationalist movement. There was, as it turned out, an Arab question to join the Jewish question.
Mm-hmm.
De Haan came to advocate for the coexistence of Arabs and Jews, advancing his first critique of the Zionist movement when Jews started banning Arabs from working their land. Barely a year after his arrival, he wrote the following sentence, quote, "Every nationalism, including Zionism, is after all only a necessary one-sidedness," end quote. In March of 1920, De Haan was elected to the religious Haredi community's governing body, which is called the City Council for the Ashkenazi Jewry. In April of 1920, he witnessed the Nebi Muz riots when an anti-Zionist speech to a crowd of 70,000 Arabs led to Arab rioting and the ransacking of the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. Witnesses indicate that the speakers specifically disavowed the use of violence, but violence is what followed. Homes and shops were destroyed, 160 Jews were injured in the days of rioting. There was sexual assault and other forms of violence as part of the attacks. Some Arabs understood this as a resistance against a Zionist invasion of their land. Many Jews understood it as the kind of pogrom they had long suffered in the Pale of Settlement. that strip of land on the Russian Empire's western border where Jews had been allowed to live. Key to the mechanism of the pogrom is that riots were tolerated or even encouraged by ruling authorities. Jews insisted that the British had foresight or had even tacitly approved of the riots, and the British denied this. The events strengthened both Arab and Jewish nationalist sentiments, and they spawned the creation of the Haganah, which was a network of Zionist paramilitaries that would later be integrated into the IDF army. In 1921, de Haan completed his formal conversion to Orthodoxy and became a representative of Agudat Israel, which was a Haredi colony led by a rabbi named Chaim Sonnenfeld. He became a litigator, and he taught law classes at the government law school, which then became Hura University. But then there were complaints because of his increasing anti-Zionist convictions. His main political project became convincing British administrators that some Jews were not Zionists. In other words, that some Jews living in mandatory Palestine wanted either the continuation of British rule or a secular state for all residents, not a Jewish state. Paradoxically, the most religious Jews often embodied this non-Zionist view. They saw Zion, the promised land of Israel, as a holy land that could only be reached in a state of religious perfection. Next year in Jerusalem meant in an imagined future, in a heaven of sorts, and it was inappropriate to cheapen this by creating a venal Israel in the present.
And you still have Orthodox movements who advocate the same position today, right?
Yes, you do. In 1922, when Alfred Harmsworth, the Viscount Northcliffe, visited, and he was important because he published both the Times and the Daily Mail, de Haan traveled to Alexandria to meet him, accompanied him on the train from Alexandria, telling him about all the problems with anti-Zionism, and when the train arrived in Jerusalem, walked him right past the receiving line of Zionist dignitaries to his hotel.
Wow.
Now, this led to a seething hatred for de Haan in the Zionist press. There were rumors swirling that he had convinced Balfour to revoke his declaration. One Zionist magazine wrote the following poem about him, quote, "The man is insane and his villainy without end, and no one throws stones at him, and no one bashes him with a bat," end quote.
Jesus.
When a theologian from the Netherlands visited him, he witnessed people spit at de Haan's feet and said, "They don't do that out of regard for you." De Haan responded, "No, they do it out of regard for you. If you weren't there, they'd spit in my face."
Wow.
In 1923, he received a note saying, quote, "I hereby inform you that unless you leave our country by the 24th of this month, you will be shot like a rabid dog," end quote. He actually gets used to this, and he starts being both a kind of combination of accepting his fate and also thinking that it's not real because there's been so many threats. In 1923, de Haan traveled with a delegation to visit King Hussein and Abdullah of Jordan. And on the trip, a friend visiting from Vienna reported him as saying, quote, 2,000 years of exile and unhappiness have taught the Zionists nothing. Instead of making an attempt to understand the innermost causes of our unhappiness, they now try to circumvent it, as it were, by building a national home on foundations provided by Western power politics. And in the process of building a national home, they are committing the crime of depriving another people of its home, end quote.
True.
Yeah. Jordan was newly independent from the British Palestine Mandate, and de Haan discussed this political idea of creating a coalition of Arabs and anti-Zionist Jews who would advocate for a secular state with full civil and political rights for the Jewish community.
So this is the reason why he didn't leave.
Yes.
He still believed in the presence of Jews in the area, but just not as a religious Jewish state.
Not as an ethno state. Emir Abdullah in the meeting stated that he would never recognize a Jewish state, but he did sign a declaration welcoming Jewish immigrants to a multi-ethnic state. And he wrote, quote, "In Palestine, our partners in government will be the ultra-Orthodox Jews because we trust them not to destroy the foundations of education and modesty of our sons and daughters," end quote.
Okay, so yeah, there's some weird anti-Semitism going on there about like similar to what's happening in Europe of cosmopolitan Jews.
It's more, I think it's more there that just a sort of trust about like deeply religious people trusting other deeply religious people.
Right.
There's a similar kind of moral conservatism. I don't know if it's anti-Semitism, but it's certainly moral conservatism.
Yeah.
Now, maybe he wouldn't have said that if he knew about de Haan's relationships with young Arab men. Now, here it's actually pretty difficult to figure out what we're talking about. And I really tried, right? There are reports about relationships with young men and with boys. We've talked about in previous relationships about European men using the Arab world as a place to live out both homosexual and pederastic desires. Now, Geert Hekma writes that, quote, De Haan's most stable and beloved and closest companion in Jerusalem would be Adel Aweda, circa 1900 to circa 1963, who figures in many of De Haan's love poems. Now, that birth date, 1900, would mean that, given that De Haan moved in 1918, he was of age the entire time he knew De Haan. Now, according to Hekma, he, quote, De Haan described the Arabs as not goal-oriented, innocent, easy-living, and irreligious, while he himself was suffering from his Calvinist work-oriented attitude, his loss of innocence, his belief. He envied Arabs' laziness and hedonism. He also praised their leaders for their cultured and civilized behavior. He was certainly fitting the image of an Orientalist, even occasionally dressing as an Arab. One wonders whether he would have gone native with the Arabs if he should have lived. End quote. So definitely this is an Orientalist fascination, right? There are plenty of poems that are at least very troubling in terms of how he talks about innocence. So here's a poem called Young Shepherds. Quote, "They know nothing, my Arab boys, of all that my panting heart alarmed. They die blessed as they were created in licentiousness and lust heart."
Yeah, so it's this really weird sort of idea of purity and simplicity and
Yeah. And this is when he starts publishing these extremely sexual poems, including a collection called Quatrains. So here's one of the quatrains. "Your tubular hand, your probing finger, the darkness smells of roses of wine. All our tomorrows this lewd pinch will linger, but for now, blessed pleasure be yours, be mine."
That's about it being fingered in the ass, right?
I think. Here's another excerpt from a late poem. This one's translated by Ludi Giebels and William Levy. Quote, "He walked dreamily, cheeks toned not bright, wilting as two sad blooms contrite. He met on this blossomy debauchee Elijah in blessed memory. The prophet who thus reproved him, whereto, depraved devil? Every fiend to whom your eyes laughed you condemn, that he finds no peaceful work, no end, that his soul eternally dies on the rim. Does your heart ever tire of this perversion?" The Ketef politely riposted a neat reply. "My soul longs never so much for turgid lusts than when it is satisfied and tired, repulsed by joys and still not rests before its wings are scorched by new delight."
Me too.
So you see this combination, right, of gay sex and religion.
Yeah.
As 1924 dawned, De Haan prepared to do two things. Firstly, he was going to expose in some journalistic writings embezzlement by the Zionist activist Chaim Kalvarisky, and second, he was going to travel to London as a leader of a delegation of anti-Zionist Jews to advocate for Palestine not to become a Jewish homeland. A man named Avraham Tehomi, who was a member of the Haganah militia, was very angry. He wrote, quote, "I saw that we too had traitors, and not communists who by their nature are traitors to their country, but a Jew organizing a crusade against Zionism," end quote. Now, Tehomi had been born in Odessa, and he was, with his shock of black hair and piercing blue eyes, the spitting image of the kind of muscular new Jew. Tehomi certainly did not decide to act alone. Later, he said that the idea came from Yitzhak ben Zvi. Quote, I did what the Haganah decided need to be done, and nothing was done without the order of Yitzhak ben Zvi. I have no regrets because De Haan wanted to destroy our whole idea of Zionism," end quote. Ben Zvi, by the way, was the second president of Israel from 1952 to 1963. Tehomi thought that if you were going to murder a Jew, you needed to give him a chance to repent. And so one day he sat behind De Haan as De Haan prayed in synagogue and said, quote, "There's a lot of bitterness towards you in the public. We don't understand what you're trying to do. We came here from Russia after pogroms that killed many Jews. We came here to save our souls, and here comes a Jew like you and destroys our last place of refuge. What are you doing to us?" End quote. De Haan accused Tehomi of abandoning his faith and screamed him away, but at this point he really started fearing his assassination. He wrote a poem that read, quote, "As a tender chick flies, so flies my poem until the gun shoots my heart," end quote. And he wrote, quote, "I'm afraid of the past because I can't forget it. I'm afraid of the future because I can't prevent it. And this is how I live in the present, like a tightrope walker. It must end in disaster," end quote.
I can't imagine the level of anxiety and also the sense that he must have had of the rightness of his position to continue advocating for this, knowing that he was about to be killed.
So on June 30th, 1924, on a Friday afternoon, as he left synagogue, Tehomi walked up to him, asked the time, and shot him 3 times point blank before running away. This caused a huge scandal, right? Rumors swirled as to who had shot him. Maybe an Arab lover, maybe another Orthodox Jew mad that he was gay, maybe a Zionist. Zionist leaders blamed one another for having committed the act. David Ben-Gurion was very against it, was very outraged. There was actually a riot of anti-Zionist Jews against anti-Zionist Jews.
Oh, wow.
His funeral was very well attended, but soon, as anti-Semitism began to grow, de Haan's memory faded. And so I leave you now with one last poem by him called Jaffa Gate. My singing heart, what is more beautiful than the gate of Jerusalem? Or in the sun a Shalkan beggar sings a song with a forlorn voice.
Bad Gaze doesn't run ads, we're not part of a big media network, and we're not underwritten by any big donors. That means our analysis and work is independent, critical, and free for the community.
Only through your generous support can we take the time to write and research each of these extensive episodes. Become part of a community of like-minded listeners by subscribing to Extra Bad Gaze on Patreon or Apple Podcasts.
Every month, you'll get access to our subscribers-only podcast where we discuss the latest in queer politics and culture, and our Gaggany Gunkles advice segments, where we take reader questions about sex, relationships, and queer life.
You don't want to miss those segments, nor do you want to miss our new jingle. So join the community at patreon.com/badgazepod or subscribe right in Apple Podcasts. And you can also check out our merch, including hats, beach towels, t-shirts, and of course our book, Bad Gaze, A Homosexual History, at our website, now in English, Spanish, and Italian. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben, for a really fascinating and complicated story. Very well explained. I'm curious about positioning him amongst other European subjects who went to the Middle East and had relationships with Arab men and sometimes Arab boys, and how they use that to think about and construct their own sexual subjectivity. I think in maybe even season 1, we talked about Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence, and how he came to understand his sexuality in some ways through the relationships he had with young Arab men, and specifically that this thing that was seen as unnatural in England at the time, his own kind of racial conception of Arabs as somehow more in touch with true nature and not being corrupted by culture, that the fact that homosexuality existed within their society showed that it wasn't unnatural, right? So it's this weird sort of racialized colonial way of constructing the gay homosexual subject in the imperial core through the relationships with people that you are actively colonizing. But that doesn't seem to be quite the case here, right? Like he arrived from the Netherlands already with quite a cohesive concept of his own sexual subjectivity. And actually it was a sexuality that changed his relationship with his political subjectivity.
Yeah, I think in that sense, the person maybe he most resembles is Genet.
Yeah.
There's a really good book by Kaji Amin about Genet called Disturbing Attachments, which basically, instead of thinking about Genet as, well, he had racist views and then he engaged in pederasty, but that brought him from the racist views and from the pederasty to this position of political solidarity. You think about all of those things happening at the same time. Like, I think the phrase is yes and. Like, all of it is happening at the same time. All of it is equally important, and all of it is occurring simultaneously. There's a simultaneity to it. And that's, I think, how we have to think about de Haan, right? Someone who does make a journey from a very racist view of Arabs, right? Take your wives and your camels and go home, to a view of Arabs as the people with whom he would rather be building his state than Zionists, but does so through these relationships that are potentially troubled or troubling, does so through the expression of ideas about Arabs that are racist and that reinforce racist ideas, right? We read that poem about my innocent, licentious Arab boys, and you were born into this sin, and that's all. We know what all that is, and we know where it comes from, and none of it is good.
And so what do you think was the sort of long-term effects and implications of not just de Haan, but especially his assassination on anti-Zionism as a movement within Palestine?
There was a breakdown. There was real disagreement within the Yishuv about whether this had been the right thing to do. People who were more on the sort of Zeb Yavitinsky revisionist right-wing Zionist side, I think, were much more enthusiastic about having done it. People on the left-wing Zionist side thought it was wrong. There was a guy named Moshe Beilenson, who's on the kind of labor Zionist movement, who said the murder was the moral breakdown of the Zionist movement. There is a lot of... He has a kind of complicated legacy in the Haredi movement, the ultra-Orthodox movement. Some people remember him as a martyr who was trying to protect the Jewish religion and then was killed. Other people are upset about his homosexuality. They're upset about his religious doubt. They're upset about his coalition with Arabs. There is one interesting bit. The first Dutch ambassador to the State of Israel in 1949 shows up and greets the president, Chaim Weizmann. And Weizmann says Dutch Jews had really helped out with Israel except de Haan.
Wow, okay, so he bore a grudge.
Then in the Netherlands, he has this kind of complete other memory, right, as this gay movement icon from the early 20th century. And the Israel part just gets left out. So he's on the Homo Monument. His work has remained in print in Dutch. It's just a different...
Yeah, it's like he had kind of two halves to his life.
He did. And one of the things that's interesting is that his story is now written about by a lot of different kinds of sources, including some newspapers, like some Jewish newspapers and magazines that are supportive of Zionism and the Zionist project. And even there now, I would say there's a little bit more sympathy, especially in the more liberal ones. I'm not using very right-wing stuff to report the episode out, but there's a kind of almost a tone of like regret about the whole thing from some of these liberal Zionist publications. And if liberal Zionism is the heir to labor Zionism of Ben-Gurion, as opposed to the right-wing revisionist Zionism of Netanyahu, which is the descendant of sort of Zabotinsky's revisionist Zionism, there maybe it would be more celebrated. I'm not sure.
But the point is that the heirs to the revisionist Zionism who have really driven Israeli society in the last 20 years.
Certainly. And it's also important to say that labor Zionism is what first annexed and occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in the aftermath of the 57 war. Right. At the moment, labor Zionism is pretty comprehensively dead, and liberal Zionism is on its last legs in many cases because, as Ezra Klein, I think, said pretty perceptively a couple weeks ago, and Ezra Klein is not usually my political compass, but he's been surprisingly good on the part of this that is about talking about how Jews are feeling about this now and like what the differences are in community. That basically liberal Zionism, especially in the diaspora, is just hitting the rocks of the conflict between what liberalism values and what Zionism is. And it's become too clear to see.
As at some point, you have to either acknowledge the facts, which it is that Israel is perpetrating a genocide against Palestinian people in Gaza, or you ignore it.
And it's also the institutions of international law and the kind of universe of international humanitarian law is extraordinarily important to a kind of diasporic liberal worldview.
Yeah.
And that is precisely what is being ignored and dismantled by this. In addition to the crime that's being committed against the people of Gaza, also a whole network of institutions are being attacked and prove meaningless.
Yeah, and that were set up in the wake of the Holocaust.
Exactly. And so the people, if you value that, you can't then also be in support of what's going on now. And so again, it's just a time for choosing. I thought it was very interesting that last week, the president of J Street, which is a very emphasis on center-left Jewish organization, which is basically like the liberal Zionist lobby in D.C. That's how they would describe themselves. The president, Jeremy Ben-Ami, said, I am no longer going to fight against the people who use the word genocide. I'm not going to defend the indefensible. I can't do this anymore.
Acknowledging that it's genocide.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was this very weird thing where he didn't want himself to use the word, but he basically said, I'm not going to tell anyone they're wrong for using the word, which is a weird
admission.
But it's anyway. The point here is not to give Jeremy Ben-Ami some tremendous amount of credit. The point here is to say there really is a breakdown right now in that, and I think de Haan, in a weird way, prefigures it, right? Like he has the experience of seeing what it is very early, very clearly.
So, in the end, how would you come down? De Haan, good gay, bad gay, good not gay, bad not gay?
Gay. Very gay.
Yeah, indisputable.
As for good or bad, I think complicated, right? I think very complicated. I think someone who really likes Genet proves the simultaneity of racism and solidarity.
Yeah. So if people are interested in learning more about de Haan, who are some of the sources that you've used for this episode?
It's a lot of articles, and I'll name some of them now, and some of them I will just include in the show notes. There's an edited volume with many authors called The Multiple Lives of Jacob Israel de Haan, an article called Jacob Israel de Haan, a Queer and Lapsed Zionist in Mandate Palestine, an article in Tablet Magazine, an article in Gay and Lesbian Review, and many others. And that article by Geert Hekma that I quoted from earlier. Plenty of links in the show notes.
Great. You've been listening to Bad Gays. If you want to find out more, you can find us online at badgayspod.com or our Patreon at patreon.com/badgayspod. If you subscribe to the Patreon, we do a monthly extra Bad Gays where we talk about all things to do with queer culture, history, what's going on in the world at the moment, and also our regular section of Gagany Gunkles, where we offer solicited advice for once. My name's Hugh Lemmy. You can find me online at hugh.substack.com.
And I'm Ben Miller, and I'm Ben Writes Things on whatever social media you choose. Until next week, bye.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Gays. Bad gays.